Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Kevin Chapman. We are super excited to dive into all things psychology, all the good stuff with sport with you here today. But before our listeners get to learn too much about you, we will dive straight into our 2 truths and a lie.
Okay, so let's see, 2 truths and a lie. So, okay, I have multiple state titles in more than one sport. I was a Street Fighter gaming national champion, and I was a Spanish Scrabble champion in high school.
Okay, so 2 of these things are true. Oh my goodness. Well, shoot. I thought I did a bunch of research on you. I listened to a bunch of podcasts, and a couple of those did not come up in the podcast I listened to. I'm gonna say, I don't know. I feel like you could be Scrabble. I'm gonna go with the gaming one. It was a lie, but don't tell us the answer. What do you think, Amanda?
I feel like I got to go with the gaming one. But I don't know. It could be kind of that sneaky thing.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna agree with you.
Okay. Okay. We'll reveal the answer to the listeners at the end. But first, kind of take us back. Like, what got you involved and interested in this field? Did you do sports? Like, we'll probably maybe learn some of our 2 truths and a lie through this, but go ahead and break it down for us.
Yeah, that's what's sneaky about my truths and a lie, because I absolutely played sports, but that doesn't mean anything. So with that being said, it was really a natural transition, Kyla, to be honest, because I was an athlete in high school and in college. So I played football and I ran track. So I've always been into sports. I've always been an athlete my whole life. Once an athlete, always an athlete. And then when I entered into college, I wanted to be in a helping profession. Had no clue what that would be. But nonetheless, I fell in love with psychology the first semester I took it. I was one of those rare people who went to college not saying I was going to be pre-med or law like most of the people around me. It was more so, I don't know, I want to do something to help people. And my first psych course, I was like, I want to be that. Never heard of it, never knew anything about it. And then I started pursuing abnormal psychology, which is the more clinical side of things. And honestly, from that, I transitioned into grad school and pursued clinical psychology, and happened to find a mentor who specialized in anxiety, which is my clinical specialty. But I also had another mentor who's like, hey, Kevin, I know you played sports and you're into sports, et cetera. Would you like to be on the sports performance team with me at the University of Louisville? I was like, yeah. So started working with Dr. Andy Meyer. And long story short, as I became acquainted with sports psychology at that point, started getting some additional experience with that and learning the trade in that regard. And then I became the sports performance psychologist there when he retired. And then long story short, and that was in 2008 or so. So I've been doing this for a long time in terms of that part. And then I, launched after being a professor for a long time into a clinician, and been working with athletes and other people with clinical concerns ever since. So
that's awesome. Wow. And going through the sports psych side of things, as a prior athlete yourself, did you kind of see some of those things and be like, oh my goodness, that's why that happened back then, or to yourself personally?
It's interesting, Kyla, because particularly in college as a sprinter, I found myself trying to psych out my competition. And this was not the nicest thing, but nonetheless, I, wanted to be mentally tough. So the things that I used to do in college to prepare myself was really interesting. I would watch a lot of film on block starts and things like in the 100 and 200 meters of my favorite Olympic athletes. And that really helped me tremendously. But I had this thing I would do, like I started thinking about how psychology applied to sport. And I was thinking, like, how do I psych my competition out so that they lose the race before we even started? So, I started putting baby powder in my spikes, right? And I would like stomp the ground, and like all this smoke would come up, right? And people were looking at me kind of like, what the heck is wrong with you, right? But I would win those races.
Oh my goodness.
So yeah, so the newspaper wrote an article about it. They're like psyching up before competition, and it was just really interesting. I just kind of intuitively knew, how can I use principles in psychology to have an advantage mentally before I performed physically? And that kind of, started me off to the races, no pun intended.
That's so interesting. It makes me think about, my husband has told me this. I don't know if you ever were a fan of Arnold, like back in the day with the bodybuilding, but he was telling me he used to do a lot of pre-competition, psychological stuff to his competitors, to psych him out, I guess. But another funny thing, endurance athletes, there was, I forget the name of the athlete, but over in Europe, he would bike around with like an onion in his back pocket, and then he would like take a bite out of it. And like all the other athletes were like, oh, there's something in onions that like must be so good for performance. And then everybody started carrying around like onions in their back pocket, and it was just to, again, psych him out. So, or maybe give him GI distress. I'm not sure.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, but very interesting connections there. So I'd love for you to kind of like break down for our listeners, what is stress? What is anxiety? What's happening in the body when we experience these things?
Yeah, so, there's a number of definitions of stress, and I tend to like to say that stress is really an emotional reaction, like a physical and an emotional reaction to an environmental demand. So ultimately, stress is something that is triggered from external factors, right? So our body is naturally equipped to navigate stressors, and that's a good thing, right? So, essentially what happens is our body from our brain is flooded with cortisol and other hormones that essentially leads to navigation of my core. My core starts to get revved up, because as athletes, as people, what's the most important part of our body that needs to respond to environmental demands? Our core. So that's why our heart rate speeds up. That's why our breathing gets more shallow. That's why we have GI distress, which is really just your digestion slowing down to prepare for threat. Like a lot of people don't know that, but all of these symptoms are very normal and adaptive. But the problem is too much of that can negatively affect not only our performance, but also our life expectancy, our health behaviors, and things like that. So that's essentially what stress is. And then I often tell people that anxiety is an emotional response, but it's not one and the same with stress. So I define anxiety as a future-oriented emotion that involves thoughts of uncontrollability and unpredictability of future events. Anxiety is never about the present moment, and how we respond to it matters, because a stressor will trigger anxiety, but we have to learn how to respond to it adaptively, else it will get bigger and be a problem.
I love that. Future events. It makes me think of like so many, as an introvert, like going to like a social event, like it's exactly that. You're like hyping, or like a race, like prepping for a race. Like, it's like, it is that future moment of like, what could possibly go wrong, or how could you perform better, or what, I listened to something you just said in a podcast. Well, I'm not sure actually how old the podcast was, but you said something about, there was kind of two types. You said one was more like performance based, and one was looking, I will not say it right. You did it. You spoke so well. But it was do you have any idea where I'm going with this? It was kind of like people who are trying to make themselves look like they're doing good, and then the other half was like actually trying to perform well.
Yeah, well, let's try to piece it together. So I think I think I know what you're trying to say. So I think perhaps I said something to the effect of how anxiety can be optimized or it can be problematic. So in some sense, we talk about performance anxiety in athletes, and performance anxiety is often this mythical concept. Oh, don't be anxious. Well, that's simply not true. Anxiety is supposed to be used to optimize performance, not to inhibit it. So the issue is that many athletes and many people in general, performers, if you will, need to learn that anxiety is a normal reaction or a normal emotional experience as it relates to environmental demands of the future. So I can optimize that anxiety and interpret it differently, which will lead to an optimal performance. I always talk about anxiety and excitement, Kyla, being the only difference between the two emotions of anxiety and excitement is my interpretation of what's happening. It's the same physiological arousal. It's the same butterflies that we often call nausea, which again is simply your digestion slowing down. That should help somebody, just that point. But I say that to say is that we optimize anxiety by interpreting it as preparatory coping, as opposed to something that's going to inhibit my performance.
Okay. And do you see people, I imagine you definitely see people improve their symptoms, but do you see situations where people over years or over a period of time, just that anxiety kind of worsens significantly?
And that's a great point. And one of my favorite quotes I like to tell people is that anxiety is rarely a problem unless it's chronic. And what we find is that people who struggle with chronic anxiety develop anxiety, quote unquote, disorders, right? So in many ways, anxiety, again, is rarely a problem if we know how to respond to it effectively, which is essentially what we teach athletes to do. But in clinical cases, people who have chronic anxiety, it can manifest in a number of different ways depending on the stressor, right? So for instance, if I'm sensitive to negative evaluation, that can develop into social anxiety disorder, which performance anxiety is really just a subset of that, if you think about it, because the fear of negative evaluation is the problem. If it's the fear of fear, then I can develop panic symptoms, right? The anxiety about having the fear response, which is really what panic attacks are, or getting out of situations where I feel like I'm going to be trapped in the case of agoraphobia, or something catastrophic happening in the case of chronic worry or OCD. So those manifestations can be chronic, right? So it's just a matter of learning how to navigate the anxiety and to, essentially learn how to work with the right person to eliminate those symptoms. So
interesting. And negative evaluation, is that something like wanting to perform well on a test or in sport, that kind of thing?
And that's something that I often see mostly with athletes, Kyla, is that very concept. Performance anxiety is essentially a subset of social anxiety, because my concern is that I'm going to perform poorly and others will see it, right? So test anxiety, that's the test per se. But if I'm a performer or an athlete, it's, well, what if I humiliate myself? What if other people see me and I embarrass myself? And what if the coach pulls me out of the game, right? And things like that.
Interesting. So this is so fascinating. I'm sure our listeners are just like geeking out too. I'm like so fascinated by all of this. So can you kind of give us, and obviously I don't want you to give away all your secrets, but with some of our athletes, and in particular, if we're thinking about our endurance athlete population, some of the things I definitely hear or see in some of our athletes is definitely like the lead up in the days leading up to the race, increased anxiety about the race. But I will also say I have a few clients where they say they feel like they're not stressed, they're not anxious. However, their body is telling a different story, like the GI symptoms, stuff like that. I'd be curious kind of your thoughts on that when someone like up here thinks they're not stressing or anxious, but there's other performance factors going on.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kyla. And I think that if we were playing Family Feud, I would say that would be one of the top answers on the board. Like, name the number one thing you often see an athlete. It's anticipation of distress, anticipation of the race the day before, the night before, the week before, etc. Good answer being number one answer, right? We often see that anticipatory distress, aka anxiety, which is what anxiety is. Anxious anticipation is technically the term for anxiety, but that's what it is. It's this idea that I'm anxious in advance prior to. Now, if we go back to what we said earlier, Kyla, I think a lot of your listeners need to really hear a very simple but powerful concept. Again, it's anxiety is what we call preparatory coping. There's a reason that you're experiencing anxiety prior to the race or whatever it might be in the future. It's because in actuality, the future threat is not performing well or not winning. That's an actual thing. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is that, number one, that's normal. One of my football coaches in high school used to always tell us before we ran on the field, if you ain't hype, something ain't right. That's a fact. Like, if I don't think there's a problem with, well, we could lose, I could embarrass myself in front of our home crowd, that's a problem. I should be thinking about that. But I have to learn to regulate that arousal in my body to prepare me to avoid that negative outcome. So what does that mean? Well, what that means for an athlete is I need to say the right self-talk to myself, right? Anxiety is normal, but I can tolerate it. That's a really good one for somebody. Ride the wave. I've prepared my whole life for this. That's another good one for someone. And what that does is that begins to regulate my arousal and allows me to focus on the process of performing as opposed to the outcome. And that's where a lot of endurance athletes and others struggle, is I'm focused on the outcome, not the process. And when I say process, I'm saying my game, my mechanics, my technique, my tactics, my imagery, and all the things that brought me to this point as a successful athlete. Those are the things that lead to successful outcome as a byproduct. So I have to shift my attention away from the outcome of competing to my process of competing, which leads to that anyway.
I like that. So would you it kind of makes me think of some concepts I've heard before in the sense of like in a race, kind of like you're saying, these future, like just getting to the finish, but it's these little incremental steps, right? Throughout, like getting to that next mile marker. Yeah.
Well, it's like we're vibing because that's exactly 100%. We're church hands, right? So the bottom line is that's exactly what I'm saying. Because let me give you an example. Like I work with a lot of runners, right? As you can imagine. And I've worked with, for whatever reason, a lot of runners who 1600 meters, right? So it's like they're talking about the mile and they oftentimes want to visualize the whole race. And I always stop them and say, wait a second, that's not how the brain works. We need images that are detailed, specific, and realistic. So we need to identify the moments in the race when your body needs to have the increased stamina and strength, right? We talk about lactic acid buildup and whatnot. And we often find that what will be the most helpful is identifying specific moments during the event where you need to, boom, kick into high gear, right? So it's like when I hear the bell, for example, is a trigger, right? When I hear people screaming at me on the backstretch when I have, say, roughly 200 meters left is a trigger, right? These are the things that my brain needs to integrate into my, say, mental imagery and visualization so that I can take each moment of the race at a time and think about my mechanics and tactics in that moment. And you'd be shocked about how many athletes' times are increased and improved and they PR as a result of focusing on each moment of a race as opposed to the entirety of it. And that's how the brain works in that way.
So are you suggesting people kind of like get this mental imagery going in the days before when that anxiety is kind of peaking to help manage that?
Yep. Not only that, Kyla, like I'm an exposure therapist clinically. So, many of the things I do with like media, many things I do with my clients is really showcasing how to confront things that trigger distress. So for example, if somebody's afraid of elevators, we don't talk about it. We ride elevators in different parts of town, different hotels, different places, different parts. And the reason I say that is because that's how I work with my athletes as well. Is not only am I suggesting that athletes need to think about those mental images about their race and specific parts of it in advance, I'm saying that many athletes have the luxury to go to that track or that field or that park in advance and identify the cues associated with their race. That tree right there, Kyle, that one, that's when I need to kick. So I need to go out and take a field trip before I'm going to actually run and whatnot, or bike and whatnot, and say, this is the moment where my body has had a problem in the past. So what we're going to do is we're going to create neural pathways in my brain and do some repetition with my mental imagery so that when I'm in that moment during the race, I just close my eyes for a split second. Because in my mind's eye, I've practiced that mental imagery repeatedly. So it downloads that program, if you will, when I'm in that moment during my race, and boom, all of a sudden I'm triggered to perform well. And I look at my watch and I'm like, oh, I kind of crushed it. Right. I'd hate for that to happen.
Before you run, kind of, right?
Right, basically.
Yeah, that's interesting. Again, all this is like making me think about personal experience stuff, but when we go mountain biking, there's trails and single tracks my husband will take me on, and I will be going like baby speed because I've never been on them before. But once you get that exposure and you've gone on it once and you start to build that confidence and when that turn's coming, that rock's coming, like you're saying with the endurance athletes, maybe when there's that climb, when you're going to pass that tree, like there's that, there's that cueing and you're building that confidence and familiarity with the surroundings and the course. That makes a lot of sense. Any suggestions for athletes who do not get exposure to the course before they race it?
Yep. I think that ultimately, for athletes who don't get that exposure, they know their race regardless of where it's ran or biked, right? So I think the key is being able to remember, again, I always talk about 4 process goals. I talk about tactics and strategies or strategic goals. I talk about technical or mechanical goals, and I talk about mental and physical goals. So if an athlete thinks about the things they need to do mechanically and tactically and mentally to prepare for their race despite where it is, I think ultimately remembering each moment in time, letting your brain tell your body, this is how my body feels. This is specifically what my right arm is doing. This is where my eyes are looking. This is how I pedal. This is what my hip is doing. Like, we need to be very detailed, specific, and realistic about my race, despite where it is. And if I replay that repeatedly, and have some semblance of mental imagery of that course, despite having been there, that's going to help me perform well regardless, because it's my process, not your process. So ultimately, that's what I would recommend.
Awesome. And is that kind of the concept too of like taking the like thoughts in the mind kind of to something outside of the body, or visual, like the visual, I don't know the name of it.
It is. No. It is. And honestly, Kyla, no, you're spot on. And that's the thing, is that clinically or performance wise, it's the same concept. When I shift my attention internally, it intensifies the physiological arousal I have and prevents me from focusing on the cues that are necessary to perform well, whether that be a conversation, whether that be a mountain biking experience, whether that be a mile race or swim, it doesn't matter. The key is shifting my attention to cues outside of myself and focusing on each moment at a time. See, that's the difference between, say, for example, a swimmer who touches the wall and they're kind of breathing hard and freaking out, versus a swimmer who touches the wall, looks up at the time, and their eyes get really big. That swimmer is not focused on the outcome. That swimmer is focused on the process. Each stroke, each underwater, each thing that I'm doing. And oh, by the way, I crush my time.
That's great. And for kind of our athletes too, thinking about we talked a bit about like the lead up, pre, and then athletes, I guess this will relate as well, I would imagine, but during a race, maybe they think they're going well, and then maybe they get a flat tire or someone passes them on a climb and they think like, oh, I'm not gonna, then they start kind of like spiraling in their head. Like, I'm not gonna, like you're saying, a future event, I'm not gonna win. I'm not gonna podium. I'm gonna be, slow. Any thoughts? Is it kind of similar concept there? Is getting ahead of it?
Yeah, well, I definitely have thoughts about that. And honestly, Kyla, here's what I always tell my athletes that I work with. That's more of that's an intervention model. And what I always like to tell elite level athletes is we have to have a preventative mentality. So we often talk about what we call a self-talk analysis, where if you're going to be elite mentally, you have to prepare yourself in advance for situations like that. So in other words, any competition has 3 phases: pre, during, and post. And for athletes to prepare themselves to be resilient for those sort of situations, we have to identify the negative self-talk that we say to ourselves before competition, during competition, and after competition, and prepare in advance for what we're going to say to ourselves if adversity strikes. So in other words, elite athletes know what they're going to say to themselves before the race even starts. It's not something where I'm like, oh, I have a flat, what should I do? Oh my gosh, I got a bite. Oh, what if I, no, I identify that in advance, and I'm practicing that at home when I'm eating bacon. I'm practicing that when I'm in the car on the way to the race, right? So I know in advance that I have a quiver on my back and arrows in it that I can pull out throughout competition for any situation.
So you got your toolkit of mental.
Facts. You have your toolkit. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have any examples or suggestions of kind of what those maybe like sayings or mantras are when someone runs into a hurdle like that?
Yeah, well, and no pun intended, because that happens too. So running into a hurdle.
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, there's different options for different athletes, right? So I would say, like, if I had to pick something that somebody could say when they run into an obstacle during competition, it would be something to the effect of, it's not the end of the world, my process, this moment, right? Breathe and remain is a really good one. So in other words, rather than escaping the situation, it's regulating my arousal and moving on to the very next moment, right? But here's what I like to tell people though, Kyla, to answer the question better, is like, if I can stockpile 4 or 5 different performance affirmations, I call them, in my brain that speaks to my ability as an athlete in my sport, then what that does is that gives me 4 to 5 options of things I can say to myself about my ability to navigate when things like that happen. For example, I could say, I'm a resilient athlete. Well, think about that. Even when things are going well, if I say that to myself, that's great. But when things aren't going well, that's super important to say to myself, right? I'm an overcomer, right? I've prepared my life for this moment. Like, these sort of statements speak to my resiliency and allows me to do the right things in the right moment to resolve this conflict that I'm having.
That's great. I think those are very helpful. And it kind of makes the resilient athlete thing makes me think of injury as well, potentially. And talking about post race, or goodness, I've heard so much too about these athletes athletes that make it to the Olympics, and it's this kind of like such a big lead up and stimulus. And then after the Olympics, it's like this kind of like post, kind of almost like depression, I think some of them may get. But I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on kind of injury, kind of mental game planning, and then maybe kind of, if we want to take it to a high level, to like these peak moments for Olympic athletes in the post situation.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you use those examples of an athlete who prepares for the Olympics and then they have this kind of post, depression type symptoms, for lack of a better way to put that, or an athlete who's worked so hard like an Olympian and then they get injured. They have kind of a similar emotional experience. And it's interesting because, this is for someone, and what I'm about to say, Kyla, is an unpopular fact. Notice I didn't say unpopular opinion. So I say that to say is the issue in either case is that it's a normal reaction to achieving or not achieving to experience negative emotionality. Point A, but here's the unpopular fact aside from that. Athletes who equate their identity to their performance will always experience negative emotionality. Absolute fact.
Okay.
I have to recognize that I'm not just my sport. I'm a whole lot of things, right? I'm a husband, right? I'm a father. All these other things that define my identity. And if I'm only equating who I am as a person to my sport, I'm setting myself up, because I live in a high achievement motivation culture, especially in the US. So if I'm not doing well, or if I'm not competing, or if I'm injured, then that means that there's no other part of my identity that's important. And that's a trap.
Yeah.
And that's so important for athletes to hear, because I have to start planting seeds now and watering them, because I'm not going to be an athlete forever. Like my body, for example, like I still feel like I'm an athlete, but I know that I can't go race a high schooler right now. There were a few years ago I could have, but nonetheless, I could get hurt. I could pull a hamstring. I could have an injury I've never had in my career, right? Because I'm older. But I know, because of my identity, that I'm a whole lot more than sport, and I'm okay with that.
That's great. I love that. Yeah, I think athletes can get really locked into these things. And I feel like too, even goodness, with social media these days, it's like that's all they're viewed as, or their sponsors want them to post about. And it's, I think can, like you're saying, can trap a lot of people in that mindset, sadly. So we talked about some tools, you said mental imagery. Do you do breathwork stuff as well? Breathwork suggestions, out of curiosity?
I do. And, honestly, there's really no wrong ways to breathe. I say that kind of tongue in cheek, just because I think we all have different names for breathing from the diaphragm, basically. Right. But I definitely do breath work. In fact, the way I describe breath work, I call it 5-6 breathing to make it simple, because athletes tend to like numbers, and, we label play calling and things like that, and we remember things a lot easier. So 5-6 breathing is based on the concept that, it takes a good 4 to 5 good seconds to inhale through your nose when your diaphragm is contracting, and then exhaling through your mouth for 6 seconds when your diaphragm is relaxing, which stimulates heart-lung synchronization. So when I use breath work, I always tell athletes that breathing is important prior to doing any other mental skill, and it helps you reset after you've done something specific. So I always say that when I teach somebody self-talk, or identifying what I call a retrieval cue to look at on your body that triggers you to do the right mechanic, things like that, it always starts with breathing, because breathing is the thing that's going to reset you physiologically to do those next things, right? So if my breathing is dysregulated, I'm not thinking clearly. So it's important to breathe prior to a mental routine or technique, but I also tell athletes to do that right after something happens as well, because that allows them to recover from what just happened, good, bad, or indifferent, and then move on to the next ball, the next play, the next cycle, whatever it might be.
And so you called it 5-6 breathing, right? And so that's something someone could implement in the pre, during, or even post.
Yep.
Very cool.
Yep. So think about
great.
it. So like, for instance, like pre, regardless of the sport, if I get a timeout, that's during, right? If I get some stoppage time in soccer, for example, that's good. A timeout in basketball, that's good. Between events, that's good, right? So those sort of things. And then after the fact.
That's great. Yeah, I think of like a triathlete, and I always think I had this one athlete, I felt so bad. He had a race where everything out of his control, like he got like multiple flats. He got stung by, I think, multiple bees. Like
Oh God.
yeah, like it was just all kinds of things were going wrong that day and all out of his control. Fortunately or unfortunately. But he kept to get together and finished, but it was just like, the
Wow.
mental strength to kind of like keep going after all of those things, I think is really powerful. So am I kind of gathering that there's a little bit of and maybe these all kind of overlap together, but it sounds like the mental imagery, is that more of like a preparatory, like pre-race situation? Or are you having people do mental imagery during and post as well?
Yeah, both and. So,
okay.
Here's my motto, Kylo. I have several, but one of the mottos relevant to your question is you want to treat competition, or I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. You want to treat practice like competition. So the competition is just cycling or just playing soccer or just playing golf, right? So in other words, you're doing all of the mental imagery and all that work in advance when you're not even in sport so that it's automatic when you are, right? So imagery as an example, you would definitely want to do imagery to prepare beforehand. You would use a snippet of it during, depending on your sport. And then you also use imagery to recover when something has happened, right? So you use it in all three phases, depending on the athlete.
And in the mental imagery component in the lead up, is that something where you suggest your athletes set aside like 15 minutes a day? Do they do that is there a time for that you usually suggest people do that, and for how long?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, in fact, so what I tell athletes who are learning to build neural pathways in their brain for whatever the mechanic is in sport is I usually tell them to start out, and this is a lot, but 3 days a week, 20 to 25 minutes, AirPods in, distraction free. If you play a ball sport or a sport that has like an apparatus of some sort, I tell them kinesthetically to hold it or put it on their feet or whatever it might be. And then they will close their eyes and they have an app on their iPhone or whatever device they use, and they press loop and they listen to it on repeat over and over and over and over and over to build those neural pathways. So see what happens is when I'm on the field or on my sport, then all I need to do is barely see that image and my body has done it a million times, quote unquote. And therefore you can download that imagery pretty fast and, have a good free throw shot or, corner kick or whatever it might be.
That's really interesting. So you said that eyes closed and they're listening to, and is this something, are they listening to you or are they listening?
They're listening to themselves.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I didn't say that. So basically and I didn't say that. I'm sorry. So basically I get them to identify imagery for whatever the skill is that they're trying to enhance. And then I always tell them it has to be audiobook quality. They need to record themselves giving detailed, specific, and realistic instruction. Cool. It's almost like saying mechanics for dummies. It's like I'm describing it with present participle language. Like, what are you doing right now? My right hand I'm extending my hands. I'm bringing the ball in, right? Like, so it's like I'm describing every mechanic.
Yeah.
And I'm being very detailed about it. Yeah.
Wow. That's really interesting. I feel like this, has to apply to like, I think of like people who, well, like yourself, who give like seminars and public speaking and like talking about that mental imagery too, as well. That's really fascinating. So 3 times a week for 20 to 25 minutes, listening to themselves on loop, describing. And how long does it take?
Game day.
And then, and game day morning, you're saying? Yeah.
And game day, like any time, like, people listen to their trap music or whatever they're listening to before they compete. It's like, I'm listening to my imagery, right? I'm listening to, so.
I love that. That's really cool. Do you, how long does it take for these neural pathways to establish, do you think? Or?
Oh gosh, a very short amount of time, like within the week, really, if you're doing it on repeat. Yeah, because most athletes have neural pathways already for the things they're trying to enhance. Right? Like I've worked with athletes who have brand new ones and it works fast. But for some athletes who, like, I've done this my whole life, right? So riding a bike, right? Muscle memory. Well, I'm big on neuroplasticity. That leads to muscle memory. Most people teach muscle memory. But what leads to muscle memory? Well, it's creating these images in my brain about whatever it is that I'm trying to accomplish. And that enhances your muscle memory.
So fascinating. Indeed. I love this. So where, out of curiosity, where do you do clinical work now, but where do you kind of like stay up to date, or do you have any mentors that you still follow and kind of like to stay up to date from, out of curiosity?
Mentors like clinically or with sports or what?
Yeah. And just from a research perspective too, like of kind of studies being done.
Yeah, well, I think primarily I stay abreast of literature, so I read obviously journal articles, and I present on this content. So you have to stay cutting edge when you do these
Yeah.
things. So scientific journals for the Association for Applied Sports Psych, Anxiety and Depression Association of America, Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. Like these are all things I attend and present at on a pretty regularly. So because of that, CEs and things, you have to stay cutting edge to be practical.
Yeah. And then with for our listeners, do you have any resources for, or maybe that you refer to, whether it's YouTube content, books, like any of that stuff that you suggest maybe listeners check out? Any other podcasts that you're on, or things like that?
Yeah, I would say let me think about that one. I would say the Par Train podcast is a really good podcast. It's specific to golfing, but there's a whole lot of really good mental content on that. Nice. The Mind Side podcast is very good. Dr. Brett McCabe, a friend of mine, he has some phenomenal content, and that's definitely for somebody who is a high performer in any sport. So the Mind Side podcast is an awesome one as well. Certainly the ASP website, so Applied Sports Psychology website, is going to have a lot of good content. But I think that those podcasts, the Par Train, the Mindside podcast, there's other ones I could think of probably after the fact, but there's a number of different really good ones.
Awesome. That's great. And for our listeners to kind of putting this kind of full picture, what kind of things, and I know we've probably given some examples, but what kind of things should our listeners kind of tune into that would maybe indicate that they should seek out working with a sports psychologist?
Yeah. So I always tell people, if they're needing a sports psychologist, first and foremost, my bias is any athlete needs a sports psychologist.
Yeah.
Because at the level of competition many of your listeners are competing at, the only thing separating them from their competition at this stage is their mentality, right? They've done all the hard work and whatnot. But here's what I like to tell people. 2 very simple criteria, Kyla, okay? So number 1, subjective distress, meaning I'm personally bothered by the level of negative emotionality that I'm having in sport. So I think that is one of the main criteria. I'm bothered by it, and this is not my baseline, right? So that's one. The second one, which is equally important, is impairment in sport. So in other words, I'm really struggling to perform at the high level. The athlete that I see more than anybody, okay, Kyla, like 90% of the time at least, is who they say to me, Kev, like I'm killing it at practice, I'm PRing, but I get in competition and lay an egg. Like that's 90% of the people that I talk to, is that they do all the things, but then they get in the competition and they're just like, they don't show up.
Yeah.
It's all mental.
Yeah.
Right. So impairment in sport, I'm not performing at the level that I'm capable of.
That in and of itself, I think is so fascinating to me, that the brain can like slow you down almost. Like I've had that with some of my runners where their paces in training, like you're saying, are just like, they're nailing it. And like their coaches is like, oh yeah, you should be able to run this pace. You're going to, get this finish time. And then they're out there and then they look at their data after, and they're like, I was nowhere near that. And I felt like I was hammering, or you like, it's really interesting.
Spoiler alert, Kyla, spoiler alert for your runners. The reason that happens in 99% of runners, 99% of them, is because even if they're not aware of it, many of them are way too anxious before the race starts. And for a runner, that is an absolute disaster, because your heart rate is already higher than it needs to be and your breathing's higher than it needs to be. So that anxiety in advance needs to be dealt with before they run. There you go.
Boom. Excellent. Mic drop. So I think that absolutely translates to a handful of my athletes. Absolutely. The during performance kind of piece there. So we covered pre, during, and post. We talked about mental imagery, breathing work, positive self-talk, I loved all of those examples. I think those are going to be super helpful. I'm going to start testing. I'm going to try and record myself and give myself hyped up.
Yeah.
Where can people find you, follow you? You mentioned some podcasts, of course, and are you taking on clients? Like,
yeah. So I'm all over the place. So like you can go to drkevinchapman.com. You can go to my center's website because I am the director of the Kentucky Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders in Louisville, Kentucky. So that's kycards.com. But I'm on Instagram, Dr. Kevin Chapman, Twitter at Dr. K Chap, LinkedIn, right? Threads. I'm pretty much on any social media you can find.
I still do not understand Threads, so we haven't wrapped our heads around that one yet. We're getting there. Awesome. Well, we didn't do our 2 truths and a lie final. So for the listeners, we had, I think what was the first one you won to sport?
Yeah, I think I said I won multiple state titles in more than one sport.
Yes.
And then
you're a gaming champ and
and Street Fighter specifically.
Yes.
Yeah, and in Spanish. What did you say?
Scrabble something. You were Scrabble champ.
Spanish Scrabble champion.
Oh, Spanish Scrabble champion. Yeah.
Yes. And we said the gaming one was the lie. What was your lie?
I don't know how y'all detected this, but yeah, it was that one. I was very good at that game I mentioned, but it was the gaming one. I was definitely a champion in track and football, and then won Spanish Scrabble in duos. Yeah.
That's awesome.
That's amazing.
Goodness.
You still speak Spanish?
Believe it or not, no, I can, but I haven't followed as much as I could, but I low key probably could because I know a whole lot of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. This has been super wonderful. I definitely appreciate your time here. You're, like I said, such a wealth of information. And I know this is going to be an amazing resource for our listeners as well to help improve their performance. So thank you again so much for joining us, Dr. Kevin Chapman.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. It was fun.